Could the strongest symbol of Putin's power in Crimea be turning into the one place he can no longer fully control? And if people are already preparing to run, then the real story is not just about land, but about fear spreading faster than any missile. Before we go deeper, do one quick thing for me. If you like sharp breakdowns without the usual noise, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Share this video with one person who wants the bigger picture, because this story is moving fast. For years, Crimea was sold to the Russian public as settled history, not temporary, not negotiable, settled. It was presented as proof that Moscow could take something huge, keep it, defend it, and force the world to live with the result. In that story, Crimea was not just a peninsula. It was a trophy, a fortress, a patriotic symbol, and a message. Putin wanted Russians to see it as permanent. That is why the recent panic around Crimea matters so much. Because when a symbol of permanence starts looking fragile, the shock is bigger than the military damage itself. Reports, satellite images, emergency measures, fuel problems, long traffic lines, and growing fear on the ground have all pushed the same question into the open. Is Crimea still the secure rear base Russia once promised, or is it slowly turning into a trap? And that brings us to the most dramatic claim of all. Reports began circulating that Russian-installed authorities were discussing plans. Plans were tied to the possible evacuation of as many as 250,000 people from Crimea. Now, that number is explosive, and it is important to say this clearly. A full official evacuation of that size has not been confirmed. But the reason the claim spread so widely is that the conditions on the ground suddenly made it feel possible. That is the real danger for the Kremlin. Once a rumor becomes believable, panic does half the work by itself. To understand why, we need to start with what changed. Crimea has been under pressure before. There have been attacks, warnings, sabotage claims, drone strikes, and damage to military assets. But what made this moment different was the feeling that pressure was no longer staying inside military zones. It appeared to spill into daily life at the same time from several directions. Power disruptions were one sign, fuel shortages were another, problems tied to logistics, supply movement, and transport security added to the tension. When that happens on a peninsula, fear grows faster because geography starts to feel personal. People do not just ask whether the army can hold, they ask a simpler question. If things get worse, how do we leave? That question becomes brutal in Crimea because the exits are limited. If you look at the map, the peninsula already carries a hidden weakness. It can feel secure when supply lines are working and defenses are layered. But once transport is disrupted, that same geography becomes dangerous. Roads choke. Bridges become pressure points. Ferry routes become vulnerable. Air routes become uncertain. A place that once looked protected can suddenly look cut off. And that is exactly why the images around the Kerch Bridge caused such alarm. Long vehicle lines heading toward the bridge were not just traffic. They were psychology made visible. Families sitting in cars for hours, fuel packed in containers, drivers worried about closures, people watching alert channels, everyone thinking the same thing. Maybe it is smarter to leave now than wait until everyone else tries tomorrow. In a crisis, traffic becomes a form of voting. It tells you what people believe, even when officials refuse to say it out loud. The bridge itself is more than concrete and steel. It is one of the most loaded political structures in the entire war. When Russia built it, the message was obvious. Crimea is connected to us forever. It was meant to turn annexation into infrastructure and infrastructure into destiny, but symbols can flip. If the bridge becomes the main road out instead of the proud road in, then its meaning changes completely. Instead of representing control, it starts representing escape. That reversal is devastating for Putin's image, because strongmen do not just depend on weapons, they depend on perception. They need their population to believe that control is deep, that plans are firm, and that history is moving in one direction. The moment ordinary people start acting like the state may not protect them, the myth cracks. And Crimea is not just any territory in that myth, it is one of the emotional centers of it. So what exactly has been feeding the panic? First, there is the pressure on logistics. Ukraine's wider strategy has increasingly focused on making Crimea harder to use as a stable military platform. That does not always mean one giant strike. In fact, the deeper strategy appears to work through accumulation. Damage a route, threaten a depot, force air defenses to stay active, interrupt fuel movement, raise insurance risks, disrupt tourism, create uncertainty around the bridge, then repeat. Each incident by itself may not look decisive. Together, they create a grinding effect. This matters because armies do not live on headlines. They live on fuel, transport, repair capacity, and communications. They need protected routes and confidence that the next shipment will arrive on time. If you can repeatedly stress those systems, you do not need to conquer territory overnight to make it weaker. Second, there is civilian strain. That side of the story often gets less attention, but it may be the key to understanding the temperature. If electricity becomes unreliable, that affects water pumping, refrigeration, businesses, and ordinary routines. If fuel becomes scarce, everything tightens. Commuting changes, deliveries slow, prices rise, vacations get canceled, shops start worrying, workers start worrying more. And once people think shortages may get worse, they begin making defensive choices. They store fuel, they pull cash, they cancel plans, they send children away, they call relatives, they watch bridges, ports, and traffic feeds like traders watching a market crash. That is how a military pressure campaign becomes a social pressure campaign without a formal announcement from either side. Third, there's the political signal sent by emergency measures. Whenever local authorities declare emergency conditions, people read between the lines. Even if officials say everything is under control, their actions can say something else. Closing camps, shifting priorities, protecting official assets, or giving special attention to state needs sends a message. The system is preparing for worse scenarios. And that brings us back to the evacuation claim. The number 250,000 is so large that it immediately changes the scale of the conversation. We are not talking about a few buses moving children. We are talking about a population movement large enough to expose geography. Could Russia even move that many people quickly and safely if the crisis deepened? That is where the story becomes less dramatic and more revealing. Because even if such a plan exists, executing it would be a nightmare. Think about the routes. The Kerch Bridge is the main direct road connection to Russia. It is critical, symbolic, and vulnerable. Any slowdown there creates huge backups. Any closure creates immediate pressure. Any striker alert changes behavior. Moving 250,000 people through that system under threat conditions would be a massive logistical challenge. That is the mechanical problem hiding underneath all the drama. Sea routes are not a perfect answer either. Ferries can be disrupted, ports can be targeted, schedules can collapse under security threats. Air evacuation sounds faster, but airports under warning conditions are not a magical solution, especially if the environment is unstable. Then there's the land corridor through occupied southern Ukraine. On paper, it offers another line. In practice, it sits under the shadow of the wider battlefield. So when people hear a number like 250,000, is it true? The right question is also, what does it say that so many people found it plausible? That plausibility comes from what Crimea has become over time. For Russia, Crimea has had several roles at once. It has been a naval base, a military hub, a political symbol, a tourism zone, and a prestige project. Those roles supported each other when conditions were stable. Tourists coming in by car helped feed normalcy. Military strength helped project security. Infrastructure spending helped project permanence. Official messaging helped wrap the whole thing in patriotic emotion. But under sustained pressure, those same roles can start colliding. A military hub attracts attacks. Attacks damage normal life. Damage scares tourists and investors. Economic decline creates local resentment and fear. Fear increases the political cost of holding the territory. And suddenly, a place advertised as a national success story starts consuming money, attention, manpower, and credibility all at once. Quick pause here. If you want more videos that explain the strategy, hit like, subscribe now, and share this with someone. That may be the deepest meaning of what is happening. Not that Crimea is collapsing in a single cinematic moment, but that the cost of presenting Crimea as untouchable keeps rising while the image of untouchability keeps fading. Tourism tells part of that story very clearly. Crimea has long depended on visitors, especially domestic travelers arriving by road. If travelers begin to associate the peninsula with shortages, bridge traffic, and uncertainty, they stay away. Fear does the filtering. A bad season does not just hurt hotels. It spreads outward to restaurants and transport workers. That creates a different kind of pressure from a missile strike, but it can last longer. And unlike battlefield losses, economic anxiety reaches into kitchens and living rooms. It changes how people talk at dinner. It changes what they tell relatives in other cities. It changes what they post in local chats. It changes whether they believe next month will feel safer than this one. Fuel shortages deepen that feeling. Fuel is not just a commodity in a war zone. It is freedom of movement. It is the option to leave. Once fuel becomes restricted or unreliable, every other fear feels closer. That is why scenes of people carrying spare fuel are so revealing. They show civilians are not trusting normal systems. They are behaving like people preparing for friction, delay, and maybe something worse. Now think about what happens when even officials are rumored to be moving their families or protecting their valuables first. Whether every report is true or not, that idea is politically poisonous. It creates a two-tier image of crisis. One level for ordinary people who are told to stay calm. Another level for insiders who may already be acting on private fears. In any system, that breeds anger. In a heavily controlled political system, it also breeds quiet mistrust. If people begin to suspect that the state has a private plan for the elite, then panic gains a moral edge. It no longer feels like random fear. It feels like betrayal. That is the kind of emotion that lingers. And Putin cannot easily solve that with one speech. He also faces a brutal image problem. For years, the Kremlin treated Crimea as proof of strategic genius. So what happens if it now needs special protection? The same territory that once showed power would start showing vulnerability. The same symbol would start projecting strain. That is why this story is larger than the peninsula itself. It reaches into the logic of the war. Ukraine does not necessarily need to storm Crimea tomorrow to change the strategic picture. If it can make Crimea harder to supply, defend, and normalize, it is already changing the battlefield in a deeper way. It is attacking the assumption that Russia can hold the peninsula at an acceptable cost forever. This is where cheap weapons and expensive infrastructure become a painful equation for Moscow. A drone does not need to destroy everything to cause strategic trouble. Sometimes it only needs to force closures and fear. If you must spend heavily to defend every route and depot, then the enemy is shaping your budget and behavior. That is strategic pressure. And there is another layer that often gets missed. Resources are finite. Air defenses, trained crews, engineering units, repair teams, and political attention all have limits. If Russia must move assets to protect one area, another area may become thinner. Choices get harder. Protect the capital, protect the bridge, protect the fleet, protect the depots, protect the tourists, protect the image. No state can do all of that perfectly under constant pressure. So the story of Crimea may be the story of forced priorities. What matters most to the Kremlin when everything cannot be protected equally? That question terrifies people on the ground. Symbols are protected first. Military assets come next. Officials protect officials. Ordinary people are told to be patient. And once civilians start believing that, they act early if they can. That is why a rumor of evacuation can have real effects even before any evacuation order appears. Russia is not simply watching Crimea fall apart. It still controls the peninsula and has major military assets. The Kerch Bridge has been attacked before and remained standing. Russia has spent years building alternate links. Ukraine has had success making Crimea less secure, but turning pressure into decisive change is harder than creating headlines. Disruption is not the same as liberation. Fear is not the same as surrender. Strain is not the same as collapse. Still, none of those cautions erase the main shift. Crimea looks less like a settled victory than it did before. In politics, that alone is enormous, because once the image breaks, consequences spread outward. If Crimea can be shaken, every Russian promise of permanent control in occupied territory becomes harder to market. If civilians start doubting stability, then confidence in other regions is not strengthened, it is weakened. If officials must plan for contingencies, then the myth of total command starts losing its shine. Myths matter in war. They shape morale. They shape patience. They shape how much pain a society will absorb. Putin has always understood the emotional side of state power. He knows that land is one thing, but public imagination is another. Crimea was celebrated so intensely to feel sacred, triumphant, irreversible. Now imagine the opposite feeling spreading through the population. Not pride, but worry. Not expansion, but traffic lines. Not security, but fuel anxiety. Not permanence, but contingency plans. That emotional reversal would hurt far beyond the peninsula. It would raise a devastating question inside Russia itself. If Crimea was supposed to be the most secure symbol and even it looks nervous, then what is still solid? That is the question Putin cannot allow to grow. Authoritarian systems survive by controlling which questions feel safe to ask, and yet reality has a way of asking them anyway. Every bridge backup asks one. Every shortage asks one. Every emergency decree asks one. Every family that leaves early asks one. How stable is this, really? The harder that question becomes to silence, the more expensive Crimea becomes to hold in every sense of the word. Expensive in money, expensive in military resources, expensive in political attention, expensive in credibility. This is why the story matters, even if the biggest claim remains unconfirmed. You do not need proof of a full evacuation order to see the strategic warning signs and the pressure on routes. The warning signs are already visible in the civilian anxiety, the economic strain, and the symbolism of the bridge. Crimea is becoming a test of endurance between two very different wartime logics. Russia's logic says time and fortification can freeze reality. Ukraine's logic says sustained pressure can make reality crack. Neither side has fully won that argument yet. But right now, the momentum of discomfort works against Moscow. And discomfort in war is not a small thing. It shapes decisions before maps change. It changes who stays. It changes who leaves. It changes what leaders prioritize. It changes what rumors sound believable. If this breakdown earned your time, hit subscribe, leave a like, and share this video so the next person sees it. Crimea may be entering a new phase where the gap between official confidence and lived reality keeps widening. If that gap widens too far, even a heavily fortified territory can become politically unstable in ways hard to reverse, because once people stop believing in permanence, they start preparing for change. Preparation is where history begins to turn. So is this truly the end of Crimea for Putin? Not yet. Russia still holds the peninsula and has options. But is this a warning that Crimea may be shifting from a symbol of strength into a source of vulnerability? Yes, that warning is real. And it may be one of the most important shifts in the war right now. If the day comes when Russia must choose between the image and the reality, that will be the moment the story changes. Maybe that is the deepest reason the evacuation rumors hit so hard. They force us to imagine the unimaginable. Not Crimea as a victory carved in stone, but Crimea as a burden in a pressure chamber. Crimea is the place where the cost of one decision keeps growing until propaganda can no longer hide the strain. That is when a symbol stops protecting a leader and starts exposing him. And if that moment is approaching, then the lines on the bridge are running straight through the heart of Putin's narrative. Narratives, once they begin to crack, can collapse much faster than concrete. So watch Crimea closely. The peninsula is showing how power looks when it is forced to defend the story it told about territory. In war, the moment a leader starts losing control of the story, losing control of the ground becomes easier to imagine. If that happens, Crimea will not only mark a military turning point, it will mark a psychological one. And those are often the turning points history remembers longest. The real question is no longer whether Crimea can be hit. We already know it can. The real question is how much longer Putin can keep selling Crimea as proof of strength. More and more signs suggest it is becoming proof of strain. That may be the question that defines what happens next.